Welcome to the Exodus and Beyond. I'm your host, author R.J. von-Bruening. In this video series, we'll be exploring the Exodus from an esoteric understanding as explored in my book, The Exodus and Beyond, Book 2 of Unlocking the Dream Vision. In this video, we'll begin exploring the mystery of the gods, Part 1. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to hit the like button below and subscribe for future videos. This series presents information based in part upon theory and conjecture of the system of esoteric symbolism. The purpose is to suggest some possible interpretation, but not necessarily the only one to the many mysteries we will explore. As we discovered in our journey through the Dream Vision of Enoch, the gods of our ancestors were not divine beings, nor were they aliens from some unknown planet orbiting some distant stars, as they and their supporters would like everyone to believe. However, we did learn that it is highly probable that they were the last intelligent species to have evolved and developed here on Earth long before ourselves. We also learned that both of our species most likely have a common ancestor, and which is why our two species are so similar. We also learned that they began moving out into the solar system, and they were setting up bases on the moon, Mars, and an unknown number of other bodies orbiting the sun when they destroyed their civilization approximately 12 million years ago. The lucky ones, the ones on Mars, somehow managed to survive, but in time they also became a highly technological advanced civilization that created an entirely new and unique civilization and culture after their civilization had been wiped out. We also discovered that this unique civilization that had developed on Mars over millions of years were the ones that eventually returned to Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago, primarily to exploit it for resources as their traditional sources of raw materials began to run low. This return to Earth and this resource extraction by these people gave rise to a significant number of creation stories. Additionally, and possibly more importantly, we also discovered that the gods that our ancestors worshipped were actually the technologically advanced craft that flew and interacted with humanity, and not the individuals inside flying these craft. The primary gods were composed of the few advanced flying ships that came and talked or interacted with individual human beings in some manner. Nevertheless, even with this knowledge, there are still a few missing pieces to the puzzle, and this theory is far from complete. Now, with our esoteric understanding of the events surrounding the Great Exodus and the many kingdoms established by the divine twin brothers, we will finally be able to fill in many of the missing pieces of the overall story and place the events into the proper order and context. To properly begin understanding this part of the journey, we must first change how we refer to these gods. In Unlocking the Dream Vision, The Secret History of Creation, I broke the gods into two primary factions, the Lord of Light faction and the Lord God faction. Although this simple breakdown worked well for explaining the overall events that unfolded as I presented them in the Dream Vision of Enoch, it falls very short for this part of the journey. So we will need to have a more accurate way to describe these so-called gods. To accomplish this, I will now refer to the ancient gods in general as the Terrans. For those who may be unaware, the word Terran is an ancient Old English word for earth. It seems like a fitting word when it's put into the context of our esoteric knowledge of the ancient world, with Terrans roughly meaning ancient earthling. The second change is that we need to understand that the Lord of Light faction virtually disappears after the Great Flood and the reconquest of Earth, with it only applying to the time of the fallen Watchers. Once overthrown, the Great Lord of Light was replaced with a new god. Within Greek mythology, the Lord of Light faction is remembered as Uranus, who was overthrown and replaced with the Titan Cronus. In time, Cronus is overthrown and replaced by Zeus. We also need to understand that these changes are actually representing political changes that are occurring within the Terrans over their control of heaven and the exploitation of the resources of Earth. As we discovered, the mighty Heaven was a massive space station that was the Terran's primary manufacturing and resource hub in low Earth orbit, that appeared like a great all-seeing eye that looked down upon all of humanity. It is easy to understand that this great space station would have had countless lights on it for various reasons that helped create the illusion that it was looking down upon Earth like a great eye to our great ancestors who looked up upon it from the surface of the Earth. It is also easy to understand that the Terrans would have changed some aspect of these lights to represent the political change, and this also represents some type of change in the government or ownership of this craft. The simplest change would have been just a change in color of the lights to represent a political change, much how we use flags to represent each nation and how they are replaced or removed to signify some type of political change. Which to our ancient ancestors witnessing this change, it must have seemed like a completely new and different God had all of a sudden appeared in the night sky. We also need to remember that one of the primary reasons for the first political upheaval that resulted in the fall of the Watchers was due to some form of strict population control that this ancient civilization practiced. We also learned from our journey through the Dream Vision of Enoch, these population controls were necessary simply because of the great difficulty feeding their people due to the limits of the natural resources that were on a fully habitable Mars. This limiting factor of the Terrans not being able to provide enough food and resources for their people seems to be the primary reasons for a vast majority of their actions and behaviors. As we will now begin learning, this is also the critical piece of information that has been missing. For us to begin to piece all of this together within the proper context, we must return to the ancient point in time that occurred after the Great Flood, when the reconquest of Earth was completed by what appears to be the Terran government. In both the Book of Enoch and within the biblical tradition, the Lord God faction, or the Terran government, took steps to ensure that the fall of the Watchers would never happen again, especially the interbreeding with humanity. What little information we have, it seems to show us that the Terrans viewed the actions of the fallen Watchers as a great abomination and a terrible crime against creation itself. Because of this crime against man and nature, the fallen Watchers were physically changed, with most, if not all of them, being physically altered in some manner so they could never mate with humans again. Not only were the fallen Watchers punished, but we learned that there were other significant changes that were made to their society to help make sure that these types of crimes would never happen again. Although we do not know the exact details, our esoteric knowledge allows us to speculate with some confidence that one of the major changes must have been of how they controlled their population growth, mainly allowing more marriages and children. With the reintroduction of the heaven and the resources provided by Earth after the reconquest, and regardless of the type of economic system they used, it would have produced a massive economic boom and a time of plenty for their society. It may have been viewed as a clear indication that it was time for them to change their ways. As expected, these changes slowly led to an increase in their population. At first, it would have been rather easy to deal with, especially with the resources provided by the heaven and earth. But as the centuries passed and their numbers slowly increased, the same old problem would begin to return. The economic and political system installed on Earth right after the Great Flood appears to have been a simple, straightforward political arrangement supported by an equally simple religious system to control our Neanderthal ancestors. Based on what little information that is available, this system seems to have been made up of a simple three-part belief that consisted of the great Sky Father up high above the clouds, the great Earth Mother here on Earth, both of which were centered around the symbolism of the bull. Our esoteric knowledge of the symbolism allows us to place this simple arrangement within its proper context, and as we take our first steps to strip away much of the confusion. We can easily understand that this arrangement consists of our ancient Neanderthal ancestors who are represented symbolically by the bull bringing offerings and sacrifices to the Great Earth Mother. Afterward, the Earth Mother would then send these sacrifices up to the Great Sky Father up above the clouds with the help of what is known or remembered as the Dawn Goddess. Although there is little physical evidence, it is highly probable that the Earth Mother would have bestowed gifts and needed items or services and resources to the Neanderthal ancestors of ours in return for their offerings. This seems to be supported by the significant number of Mother Goddess artifacts that date from this time. These artifacts are generally small figurines of statues of faceless women with extremely large breasts and belly. These artifacts are believed to portray a pregnant Mother Goddess related to fertility, with the idea that she was the great giver of life. Based on the scant evidence that we have of this Mother Earth figure or Mother Goddess was by far more important to our ancient ancestors at this time than the distant Sky Father high up in the sky. Now, this then allows us to take the next step to begin stripping away the mythology to understand that after the Great Flood, the government had reestablished their control over the group of Terrans on Earth that controlled our ancestors. Remarkably, within all the ancient mythology, the Earth Mother is the only one of the gods that seems to always be present, no matter the epoch, including before, during, and after the fall of the Watchers. This seems to support the idea that the creation of the first men, the Terrans, had always had some presence on Earth to exploit our ancient ancestors, with it always taking the form of or being viewed as a mother-like figure. This appears to have been done so our Neanderthal ancestors would gather food and resources for them to be transported up to the heaven or Sky Father and then to the rest of their civilization. Although the mythology clearly tells us that our ancient Neanderthal ancestors were being exploited by these Terrans, they were not the primary source of resources. According to the mythology, the Terrans employed massive machines for industrial extraction of metals and other mineral resources that they needed to support their civilization. Remarkably, the mythology also implies that these great machines were not under the control of the Terran government nor the Terrans on Earth, but were in fact controlled by an unknown third party. It is also very apparent that for much of this time, the heaven itself was under the control of this unknown third party. Although we are clearly missing countless details, this basic arrangement appears to have existed from about the end of the Great Flood and the reconquest of Earth at around 72,000 BC to the coming of Cro-Magnon man at around approximately 39,000 BC. This simple system appears to have been very stable with no evidence that it changed in any meaningful way over this 33,000 year period. However, as we already know, starting around 39,000 BC, the political situation begins to change. Based upon this information, it appears that it took approximately 33,000 years for the Terran population to grow to a point where they began once again having problems supplying enough food and other resources from Earth to feed their people and maintain their civilization. By understanding that a large part of the Terrans' motivation on Earth was centered around food production to feed their ever-growing people and the metal resources to sustain their civilization, we can now easily understand that the coming of Cro-Magnon man must have been a direct result of their need for greater production to feed and supply their ever-growing population. It is rather apparent that Neanderthal simply could not keep up with the ever-increasing demand for more resources. This demand is why the Terran government decided to improve the stock by breaking Neanderthal into at least two separate subspecies, with one being our more intelligent and immediate ancestor Cro-Magnon man, who could produce more and handle more complex societies, with the other being the ever mysterious hairy man of legend and myth. This change resulted in some type of war among the Terrans. This is the war that is vaguely remembered in the book of Genesis as the War of the Kings that resulted in the destructions of the cities of the plains, forever remembered as the sinful cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. It is this almost forgotten war that the first radioactive spike found in the ice cores that dates at approximately 39,000 BC. This first radioactive spike and the biblical story of the destruction of the cities of the plain shows us that the Terrans did not have much of a problem using nuclear weapons or devices against one another and our ancestors. This will also give us our first glimpse into a few other possible political motivations for the Terrans on Earth. This first radioactive spike proves the Terrans used nuclear technology and most likely weapons in this little war. According to the biblical account, it's rather clear they had no problem using such weapons against our helpless ancestors, with rather detailed descriptions given for the destruction of the cities of the plains. The use of these weapons appeared to have been a direct result of the Terran government changing our ancestors from Neanderthal into a more intelligent and effective slave we now call Cro-Magnon man. Based upon the information we have, it appears that one of the primary reasons these weapons were deployed was simply to remove a now unwanted Neanderthal population. This allows us to easily understand that there must have been many Terrans, especially the ones on Earth, that must have had a moral and or ethical problem with using nuclear weapons against such a completely helpless population. As with the fallen watchers, it appears that these Terrans on Earth saw our ancient ancestors as more than mere animals to be exploited and exterminated as needed. Although we have next to no information on how this disagreement unfolded, it is an important one that does seem to have influenced later events. Based on what little information is available, it appears that this first war of the gods was a relatively short-lived affair, with an agreement being reached rather quickly between the warring parties. This agreement appears to have left the original agreement intact. The only real change seems to be that Neanderthal was to be bred out of existence instead of being exterminated with nuclear weapons. He would also be replaced with two species, again, one being our immediate ancestor Cro-Magnon man, while the other being the more mysterious hairy man of legend and myth. It also appears that the Earth Mother or Earth faction of Terrans was left in control of the human population. Nevertheless, as we will learn in rather good detail, there was a second phase to this agreement that the Earth faction may have been entirely unaware of until it was too late. This second phase of the agreement took the form of the Terran government assembling a group composed of all the different ethnic and racial groups of humanity organized into numerous tribes. These tribes were then focused on the worship and service to a new pantheon of gods. Based upon the available information, it is difficult to know why these tribes were initially placed in Egypt. However, one of the most likely reasons was because the Egyptian civilization could sustain them and their growing numbers. Once this group had grown large enough, they were then guided out of Egypt and then around the world by the King of the Gods, commonly known as the Lord of the Waters. The purpose of this great exodus appears to have been the establishment of a more uniform society and belief system upon the entire world of humanity. Using our esoteric knowledge, we can now understand that the primary purpose of this entire undertaking was simply to take over the entire operation on Earth that was focused primarily on food production and resource extraction. Shortly before this great exodus, there is another war of the gods that breaks out between the Terran government and the Terrans on Earth. Unlike the first war of the gods, this war does not appear to have been a short-lived affair, but a prolonged event with many destructive battles that completely reshaped the political, economic, and religious landscape on Earth and possibly their entire civilization. What is remarkable is that although we know a great deal about this war, it has always been placed in the wrong part of the story. This is a situation that is exactly the same as the placement of Enoch within the story, where Enoch has been traditionally believed to have come at the beginning of the story, wherein the truth is that he is much closer to the end of the story. In this case, the great war of the gods, it has always been believed to have come at the very beginning of the story, but as we will now begin to learn, its proper place is closer to the middle. To begin this part of the journey, we must first fully understand that the polytheistic pantheons of the ancient world, like the Greek, Hindu, and other pantheons of the world, and the gods associated with them, they all originate from the people who took part in the second phase of the great Exodus out of Egypt under the leadership of the divine twin brothers and the new kingdoms they established. Therefore, all the myths, legends, folklore associated with this new pantheon of gods also originate just before, during, and shortly after the great event of the Exodus out of Egypt. Additionally, these ancient Israelites, as they become known, are the people we historically know as the Proto-Indo-European people that first settled on the Iranian plateau and the many different valleys of the Zagros Mountains after leaving the land of Egypt. This brings us to a point where we need to return to the Proto-Indo-European mythology to understand this great war in heaven between the gods. As we learned, the earliest Proto-Indo-European mythology is the mother belief that provides the backbone for all the different pantheons of gods the world over. It is this ancient Proto-Indo-European mythology that is the source material for all the later beliefs. Slowly, over time, the original mythology of the Proto-Indo-Europeans underwent a great change as it fused with other societies, cultures, and traditions. Although the original mythology underwent significant change, there is a small handful of myths with details that have always remained the same no matter the culture or how many centuries or millennium has passed since the actual events occurred. Within one of these universal myths, the Proto-Indo-Europeans, which is also believed to be one of the oldest, is where we begin to learn the answers to many of the mysteries we have been exploring. Within this ancient mythology, we find a universal story that speaks of a great war of the gods, where the mighty Sky Father was overthrown by one of his children with the aid of his mother, the Earth Mother. Once this new god defeats the Sky Father, he then betrays the Earth Mother. Because of this betrayal, the Earth Mother begins to give birth to a terrible monster to fight against this new supreme god. After a series of horrible battles, this new supreme god defeats this terrible monster, with the Earth Mother becoming his consort or wife. In all the versions of this myth, this great monster created by the Earth Mother takes the form of a great and powerful serpent. Hence, the myth is commonly known as the Serpent-Slaying myth. Although the details of the Serpent-Slaying myth often vary from culture to culture, there are several key features that always remain the same. Within all the myths, this great serpent is always somehow associated with water and is thought of as being multiple in some matter, with it either being multiple-headed or having multiple tails or multiple hands or multiple weapons protruding from its body. This monstrous serpent is always associated with the Earth Mother and was created to do battle with the new supreme god, her son. A son that she had aided so he could defeat and then replace the great Sky Father. According to the myths, there are two separate encounters that occur between this new supreme god and this great serpent that resulted in massively destructive battles. In their first encounter, the great serpent defeats this new supreme god after an epic battle that lays destruction to many lands. In all versions of this myth, the great serpent defeats this new supreme god in the first battle by making it impossible for him to use his power in some fashion, normally by denying him the use of his mighty thunderbolt. In many versions, he is also rendered helpless by being immobilized somehow. After this first epic battle that left the new supreme god immobilized and powerless, the great serpent and the mother goddess celebrate their victory. While unbeknownst to them, the other gods come to the aid of their brother god by healing him in some manner that allows him to use his most powerful weapon once again, the mighty thunderbolt. This is another common feature within the serpent-slaying myths, that this new supreme god's primary weapon is always the mighty thunderbolt. Once he is healed and he can use his thunderbolt again, he launches a new attack against the great serpent. After another epic battle that shakes the foundations of the earth and threatens to destroy all of creation itself, the new supreme god finally strikes the great serpent down in a hail of mighty thunderbolts that destroys the fearsome beast. After this great victory, the new supreme god then takes his place as the Sky Father, along with his brother and sister sky gods, who assume their places and rulership over all of creation. One of the primary reasons this myth is so crucial to the Proto-Indo-Europeans and the later cultures descended from these people is that this story is directly connected to the creation stories of the gods themselves and the earthly society they created for humans. By understanding that this creation story originated from the Proto-Indo-European people and combining it with our esoteric knowledge, we can finally realize that this creation myth is speaking of a violent political takeover. We'll also learn that this myth provides a wealth of information about the political situation that existed among the Terrans at this ancient time. To help us understand this myth and war of the gods, we need to explore one of the more complete versions of the creation myth that we currently have, which is found in Greek mythology. The Greek version of the serpent-slaying myth is when the mighty Zeus battles the dreaded monster Typhon. This myth is also the origin story of Zeus' birth and of his fellow Olympians, which resulted in the overthrow of his father Cronus along with his fellow Titans. The Greek myth begins long ago with the Earth Mother known as Gaia and the Sky Father commonly known as Uranus. It is these two ancient gods that are the ones that give birth to the great and terrible monsters known as the Titans. The first of these monsters that came forth were three monstrously huge and powerful strong creatures that each had 100 hands and 50 heads. These horrible monsters were then followed by the three Cyclopses, who each had an eye like a great wheel in the center of their faces, and then finally the mighty Titans, which there were numerous ones. Although these monsters and the Titans were the children of the Father Heaven, the myths tell us that he was a poor father to them. He is said to have hated the creatures with 100 hands and 50 heads, even though they were his firstborn sons. He imprisoned each one in a secret place deep within the earth after each birth, where they clawed away at the earth day and night, trying to escape their underground prisons. Whereas he left the Cyclopses and the other Titans at large to roam the earth, doing as they pleased. Gaia, the Earth Mother, became enraged at her children's mistreatment by the Father Heaven and appealed to all her children to help her. Only one of her children was bold enough, the great Titan Cronus. Cronus lay in wait to ambush his father and wounded him terribly in the attack. Although the Greek myth is vague, it does not say that Cronus actually killed Uranus, but it is heavily implied that Uranus died from his wounds he suffered after the ambush. The giants, the fourth race of monsters, are said to have sprung from Uranus' blood, although this is the same blood that the Urnies or Furies were born of. Their office is to pursue and punish sinners. They became known as those who walk in darkness. They were terrible of aspect, with writhing snakes for hair and eyes that wept tears of blood. In time, the other monsters were driven from Earth or under the control of Cronus, except for the Furies. As long as there was sin in the world, they could never be banished. From this time forward, for unknown ages, Cronus, with his sister queen Rhea, was Lord of creation and the universe. Rhea was a Titan and the older sister of Cronus. She, like Cronus, was a child of Gaia and Uranus. In the earliest traditions, she was known as the mother of the gods and became strongly associated with Gaia. Rhea appears to be a slightly different version of Gaia. In classical times, Greeks saw her as the mother of the Olympian gods and goddesses, with her usually taking Gaia's place within the mythology. However, she was not an Olympian goddess in her own right. Depending on the myth, sometimes Rhea was the daughter of Gaia, while in others she takes the place of the mother goddess. This is another example of the Indo-European people fusing with the local cultures as they moved around the world. This time of Cronus and Rhea was believed to have been a golden age, as the people of this time did not lead laws or rulers, and everyone knew what they were doing was the right thing, and immorality was absent from the world. Sometime during his rule, Cronus learned that one of his future children would dethrone him, and he thought he would go against fate by swallowing each of them as soon as they were born. As time goes by, Rhea gave birth to 5 children: Poseidon, Hades, Hesta, Demeter, and Hera, each of which Cronus swallowed to prevent his overthrow. This enraged Rhea, so she devised a plan to save her children and to eventually get retribution upon Cronus and his acts against his children, and for also betraying his father. Rhea then subsequently tricks Cronus by hiding her 6th child, Zeus. After hiding Zeus, she then wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes as a substitute. Cronus promptly eats this presentation from Rhea, not suspecting the swap in lieu. Zeus was raised in secret, and when he had grown, he, with the help of his grandmother, Gaia, forced Cronus to dislodge his brothers and sisters and the stone. Thereafter followed a great and terrible war between Cronus, with the help of his fellow Titans, against Zeus and his 5 brothers and sisters. It was a war that was so destructive that it was said to have almost destroyed the entire universe. A dreadful sound troubled the boundless sea. The whole earth uttered a great cry. Wide heaven shaken groaned. From its foundation far Olympus reeled, beneath the onrush of the deathless gods, and the trembling seized upon black Tartarus. During this war of the gods, which is commonly known as the Great Titanomachy within Greek mythology, Zeus, with the aid of his brothers, his sisters, conquered each of the Titans and eventually overthrew Cronus. Zeus was also aided by releasing the powerful monsters with 100 hands and 50 heads from their prisons, who fought along with them with their irresistible weapons of thunder, lightning, and earthquake. Additionally, the Titan Prometheus, and who was known for his great wisdom, sided with Zeus. After defeating his father, Zeus is said to have punished his conquered enemies terribly, with many of them being imprisoned within the realm of Tartarus. This was a deep abyss that was used as a dungeon for the Titans and to torment the wicked. Even after the Titans had been conquered and crushed, Zeus and his fellow Olympians were not wholly victorious. Although the myths do not give us many details, Zeus's grandmother, Gaia, gave birth to her last and most frightful offspring, a powerful creature that was more terrible than anything that had come before, the dreaded Typhon, a flaming monster with 100 heads, who rose up against the gods. Death whistled from his fearful jaws, his eyes flashing glaring fire. In their first encounter, the dreadful Typhon was victorious by catching Zeus off guard and ripping his tendons from his body, leaving us helpless and useless. Typhon also stripped Zeus of his most potent weapon, his mighty thunderbolt. As Typhon and Gaia were celebrating their victory, Zeus's brothers and sisters secretly helped him regain his tendons and, more importantly, his ever-famous weapon of thunder and lightning, the thunderbolt, which from this time forward no other god was able to use. Once restored, Zeus sat out for a new battle with Typhon. In their second encounter, and after another epic battle, Zeus finally strikes the terrible beast down in a hail of mighty thunderbolts that shook the entire world. Although Zeus, with the aid of his fellow Olympians, had finally conquered all that had opposed them, still later they would learn that there would be more attempts to unseat the mighty Zeus as the new supreme god. Nevertheless, by the time these other rebellions occurred, Zeus had become the strongest of all gods. The first attempt was made by the giants, who were still loyal to Cronus, but they were quickly defeated and hurled down to Tartarus. From this point forward, Zeus and his brothers and sisters were undisputed lords of all of creation and Olympus. The second attempt was made by his fellow Olympians, who had come to believe Zeus had abused his power, but they too were also quickly defeated by Zeus. With our esoteric knowledge and using the symbolic timeline, we can understand this myth in a way that's never been imagined before. In the process, we'll come to learn of some of the political events surrounding the Terrans. Additionally, we must always remember that this ancient mythology and the stories that come from our folklore originally come from our immediate ancestor, Cro-Magnon man. This means that we must always keep in the back of our mind the mental limitations of our Cro-Magnon man ancestors with their mental inability to understand advanced technology in other terms but magic or the divine power of the gods. To begin anew, we must return to the original narrative with our first point of reference and realize that the time of Gaia, the Earth Mother, and Uranus, the Father Heaven, are referring to the time during the fall of the Watchers. The great overthrow of Uranus by Cronus at the request of Gaia refers to the reconquest of Earth at the time of the Great Flood. This implies that much of the political disagreement was focused on the use of the great titans and the resources they provided. Although the myth is vague, it hints that some type of agreement existed between the parties during the fall of the Watchers, and much, if not all, of the conflict was based upon needed resources and the use of these massive machines. Unfortunately, the myth just does not give us enough information to say much else about the situation. Soon after this overthrow of Uranus begins, the long, peaceful golden age of Cronus and his sister wife Rhea begins. This time refers to the thousands of years between the reconquest of Earth that included the event remembered as the Great Flood through the time of the Exodus out of Egypt. Within the esoteric timeline, this would be the time period between approximately 72,000 BC to 32,000 BC. It is during this time that the simple religious idea of the Sky Father, the Earth Mother, that was centered around the symbolism of the bull, comes into being. Strangely, and for unknown reasons, the Earth Mother figure appears to be the most important during this time. With our esoteric knowledge, we can easily recognize that both Father Heaven, Uranus, and his overthrow by his son, the Titan Cronus, is referring to the events that occurred on or around the mighty heaven floating high above the surface of the earth. As we will shortly learn, the Titan Cronus, as well as the later Zeus, represents a smaller craft that was used to attack, defeat, and then take over the heaven, which then takes on the mantle to become the supreme god or the heaven. Rhea, Cronus' sister wife, is much more mysterious. She is by far the most important of the gods of our ancient ancestors at this distant time. As we will shortly learn, the Earth Mother symbolizes the main manufacturing facilities here on Earth as seen through the eyes of our ancient Cro-Magnon man ancestors. She also represents any transport ships that were used to supply the heaven, with many of them becoming the various goddesses of the ancient world. Now, this might seem a bit confusing at the moment, but this is where our esoteric understanding that the gods were the technologically advanced craft that the Terrans flew and not the Terrans themselves that will greatly aid us in understanding the next phases of the story and how these events unfolded. This requires us to properly understand that precisely that this Earth Mother was and how it was seen through the eyes of our Cro-Magnon man ancestors. For us to understand what our Cro-Magnon man ancestors were really seeing when they saw the Earth Mother, we must take a moment and imagine a large modern-day industrial manufacturing complex with a central assembly building, which is usually a long, narrow-looking central building. In modern-day industry, this type of building can be up to a dozen or so blocks long, surrounded by dozens of outbuildings that prepare material, parts, and other equipment necessary to produce the final product. With this simple idea in mind, and we begin to imagine what our Cro-Magnon man ancestors would think if they saw such a complex. We also need to consider and remember the limited mental abilities of our Cro-Magnon man ancestors. By doing this, it is easy to understand and imagine how our ancient Cro-Magnon man ancestors would describe this type of large manufacturing complex in the same manner as they did with all the other technology they saw or encountered. They would describe it as being a living creature, but it would be unlike any living creature they knew. From a distance, our ancient Cro-Magnon man ancestors would see all kinds of different activities occurring in and around this complex, with the large central assembly building naturally standing out to them. It is easy to imagine how our Cro-Magnon man ancestors would see this vast industrial complex as if it was truly alive and as a great living creature. To them, they would see it breathing by taking in vast amounts of air and expelling toxic waste gases. At night, they would see lights turning on and off with the buildings glowing like a fantastic and mysterious beast. They'd also hear loud and strange sounds as the equipment and materials were moved around the site and manipulated. They'd also see it eating as it took in raw material at one end of the building, and then after a long, strange, mysterious, unknown process, it would give birth to a finished product out the other end of the building. This simple understanding allows us to realize that the great Earth Mother was most likely a tremendous industrial manufacturing assembly building with a much larger industrial complex surrounding it. This allows us to take the next step to understand that the sister wife of Cronus, Rhea, must have been a large transport ship which would then take the finished product or child up to heaven, or Cronus as our ancient ancestors would have thought of it. Upon arriving in orbit, this large transport ship would then transfer the product or child to the heaven for the final work to be prepared to be transferred to Mars or other parts of their civilization. For our Cro-Magnon man ancestors looking up from below, it would have looked like Cronus was eating his children. In this case, the final product or children were 6 highly advanced craft. However, we're told in the myth that the 6th one was replaced by a defective or sabotage copy of that craft, while the real one was constructed in secret and hidden on Earth. The 6th one, along with the aid of numerous other allies on Earth, was used to force Cronus to vomit up his children, which then aided the 6th ship in conquering the heaven and eventually the operations on Earth. Although we're missing many details, this basic information allows us to understand this ancient myth in an entirely new manner. We can now understand that our ancient Cro-Magnon man ancestors were seeing the preparations of war by the Terrans and then the war itself. Nevertheless, they could not understand or know of the actual political workings or motivations going on behind the scenes. Although our ancient ancestors were not aware of the broader political factions at work, we can infer several of them if we take a closer look at the Babylonian creation myth known as the Ummah-Ish, or the 7 tablets of creation. In our next video, we'll explore this Babylonian creation myth and how it's related to the Greek one, and unlock a few more secrets and mysteries of the gods. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button below and don't forget to subscribe for our future videos.